everybody, welcome to the Let's Fix Stuff Solution Podcast Series. I'm your host, Patrick Kolbeck. In this Solution Podcast, we're going to address election integrity. This is Build 2.0 of our Election Integrity Solution Podcast Series. Build 1.0 was released in August of 2020. This particular version builds on insights gained from that fun little 2020 general election. We have a lot to unpack on this topic of election integrity. I've been studying this topic for the better part of 10 years as a candidate, a two-term state senator, and later as a poll challenger. In support of the assertions that I make in this podcast, I have served as vice chair of the Michigan Senate Elections and Government Reform Committee. I took that post very seriously and diligently studied all of our election manuals. I applied tools such as process mapping and failure modes and effects analyses learned during my aerospace engineering years to the subject of elections. I then proceeded to coordinate and validate all my findings with experts such as Catherine Engelbrecht with True the Vote. And in support of the technical observations that I make in this podcast, people should know that I'm a certified Microsoft small business specialist and was responsible for the cabling design of the Quest airlock module on the International Space Station. In other words, I'm not only familiar with the latest in election processes, I'm also experienced with the information technology used in these processes. Links to information referenced are in this podcast, including the analysis of the solutions posed in the conclusion section, are available at letsfixstuff.org. I believe that this podcast on election integrity will be invaluable to anybody truly interested in preserving the integrity of our elections. So let's get started. As in previous solution podcasts, this presentation is structured to follow my tried and true engineering trade study analysis approach. First, we frame the problem we are trying to solve. Then we provide background information useful in understanding the problem a little bit better and useful in evaluating the effectiveness of potential solutions to these problems. With this background information in hand, we then go on to define specific objectives that can be used to evaluate and rank any solutions that we propose. Then we provide a list of potential solutions. And then these solutions are analyzed and ranked in our conclusion section. Why all this structure? Well, unlike most of the approaches taken by our elected officials, I want to be as transparent as possible as to how I arrive at the conclusions that I make. In addition to all the information provided in this structured podcast, you can also download my notes and analysis spreadsheet at letsfixstuff.org. Okay, that's the path ahead. Time to go off and fix election integrity. All right, let's start by asking a pretty basic question. Does election fraud actually exist? Now, I ask this question because during the 2020 election cycle, the media subjected us to a continuous mantra of there is no such thing as election fraud. Well, you know what? I beg to differ. Thus, this podcast. And in support of my assertion, I was a poll challenger at the Detroit Absentee Voting Counting Board on November 3rd, 2020 until the evening of November 4th. I certainly witnessed election fraud, as did over 100 other poll challengers who signed affidavits under penalty of perjury to that effect. Now, don't take it from me, though. Let's hear it directly from a prominent commissioner on the Board of Elections in New York City by the name of Alan Shulkin.
Right. Like I say, people don't realize certain neighborhoods in particular, they bus people around to vote.
Oh, like minority neighborhoods, like black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods?
The Chinese, too.
Oh. Why do they do that? Just to get like more votes for Democrats or?
Almost themselves. They're all running for office. Your vote gets discounted because they come in with a burger on it and they can vote. People think, it's a liberal thing to do, but I take my vote seriously. And I don't want 10 other people coming in negating my vote by voting for the other candidate when they're not even registered voters.
Well, maybe you won't vote for Hillary. I don't know.
I would. I have no choice.
Well, that video you just witnessed was the New York City Democrat Board of Election Commissioner admitting to systemic voter fraud. Voters are bussed from one polling station to another to vote multiple times. That's what you just saw. Here is what the commissioner had to say about voter ID laws in New York State. Roll that tape.
Well, New York doesn't have voter ID laws, right? New York?
No, you can't. You cannot ask.
Say what?
They can't ask for voter ID.
Why's that? They can't.
The law. The law says you can't ask somebody. Which they really should be able to do. I don't think it's too much to ask somebody to show some kind of an ID.
Yeah. I mean, why not? I mean, you have to show an ID for everything else.
Right, you go into a building, you got to show them your ID.
Well, you're the commissioner, you said, of the Democratic election commissioner. So if you think there's voter fraud and you think there should be voter ID, why don't people listen to you? I mean...
Well, that's because the New York State legislature makes the laws. I don't make the laws.
And you think there's a lot of absentee ballot fraud, too?
Oh, there's thousands of absentee ballots. I know where they came from.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, Hillary Clinton doesn't support voter ID laws. Like...
I know. That's why I'm not always crazy about everything the Democrats do either.
Well, first step in solving any problem is actually admitting that you have a problem, right? The 2020 election clearly demonstrated that, to anybody that was paying attention, that we have problems with the integrity of our election system in America. In fact, we have so many problems that I'd like to break them down into the following groups. All right, first of all, I want to highlight chain of custody violations. Then we'll look into statutory violations. Then we'll look into constitutional right violations. And then we're going to delve into something called influence operations. Now, before I go into any more detail on each of these problem groups, I want you to note that my examples are heavily focused upon the election fraud that I observed in Michigan, although a lot of these issues were experienced elsewhere in the country, particularly in the battleground states. But a lot of focus is on Michigan. So let's first look at examples of breaks in the election record chain of custody. Now, let's go over what the term chain of custody is. You know, in a criminal court case, failure to demonstrate a secure chain of custody for evidence can result in the overall dismissal of a court case. Chain of custody is equally important for election records. If any single link in the chain of custody is broken, the integrity of the election is in question and should not be certified. Let's focus upon 4 key links in the election record chain of custody: the qualified voter file, poll books, ballots, and vote tallies. And let's start by looking at some examples of election fraud observed in Michigan during the 2020 election. And let's start with the qualified voter file. Now, the qualified voter file is kind of just a fancy term for a list of people that are eligible to vote in a given state. Now, if this link is broken, it breaks all the links downstream, including the final vote tally. Now, during the 2020 election in Michigan, almost 8.1 million voters were eligible to vote according to the qualified voter file. According to an analysis of who is eligible to vote based upon publicly available records, over 600,000 of the eligible voters were actually not eligible. Now, just to refresh your memory, the publicized victory margin for Joe Biden in Michigan was only 154,188 votes. Now, let's look at poll books. Poll books are precinct-specific extracts of the qualified voter file. They are used by poll workers to validate the identity of somebody attempting to vote and tracking their vote status. Now, if this link in the chain of custody is broken, all links downstream of it are broken, which makes ballot recounts meaningless. Now, during the 2020 election inside of Michigan, this gateway failed. Not only were there multiple versions of the poll books for a given precinct, ballots cast by voters not in the poll book were actually still counted. Now, perhaps the most egregious demonstration of breakage in the poll book link was evident during the canvassing of the Wayne County election results. Now, it was evident to canvassers present on the first day of canvassing that precincts featured as many as 600 more ballots than indicated on the poll books. Then, miraculously, the night before the Wayne County election certification vote by the Board of Canvassers, a mysterious black box appeared with poll book supplements. Now, upon incorporating these supplements to the poll books in unbalanced precincts, the official maximum balance discrepancy was only 29 votes. Now, under Michigan statute, such actions are grounds for quo warranto remedy. In other words, it nullifies the election results. All right, here's an example of fractional vote tallies that were actually intercepted in the data stream from Dominion servers to Edison research servers on the day after the election. There is no explanation for fractional votes except for intentional fraud. All votes should be whole numbers, not fractions. Dominion Voting Systems enables fractional vote allocations with its ranked choice voting module. Use of this module enables users to allocate percentages of votes from one candidate to another. There is evidence that this module is active in the only county where outside observers were allowed access to the electronic data, and that was Antrim County, Michigan, where 6,000, or actually almost 7,000 votes were flipped from President Trump to Joe Biden. Now, in addition to fractional votes, any voting system components which are connected to the internet break the integrity of the chain of custody. There is evidence at the Detroit AV Counting Board that this was the case, and I observed that. Over 172,000 votes were counted at the Detroit AV Counting Board. Every one of these votes were vulnerable to what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack as a result of this network connectivity. In other words, election officials transferring vote tally data from point A to point B are actually vulnerable to a diversion of their data to point C, where the data can be changed before sending it to point B without point A or point B knowing anything about it. Did such a manipulation of data occur during the 2020 election? Well, there's hard evidence that it actually did occur, as highlighted in the documentary Absolute Proof.
Well, everyone, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. What you're going to see now is 100% proof that we had upon our country the biggest cyber attack in history. And I'm going to bring on Mary Fanning to explain how it all happened and show you the 100% proof. Mary, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mike. Today we've been watching cybersecurity experts, and they've explained some of the things that happened in the election, some of the election fraud. But what we're seeing here is, if you look at this chart, is that there were cybersecurity experts who began collecting information on November 1st. And so this was before, during, and after the election, that they were collecting documentation. In fact, they collected terabytes of information that document the election fraud, the foreign intrusion into our election. This was collected in 2,995 counties in the United States. This was collected in real time. All right, so if you go to the chart, what you will see is the documentation of foreign interference in the election. The first column, if you look at the chart, that shows that on 11/5/2020 at 7:43 and 38 seconds, we had a foreign intrusion, and it shows the IP address, the Internet Protocol address. That is the number of that protocol address of the hacker that entered into our election. The second column is the owner or source of that IP address. That shows that ChinaNet in Beijing province entered the election. It shows an ID. That is the unique address of a computer. That shows the exact computer using that IP source that entered into our election. The next is the target. That's the IP target. That's the Internet Protocol address of the target. All right? Then the next is the target state. In this case, it shows that it's Michigan. Where in Michigan? That's the next column. It shows that it's in Emmett County, Michigan. Then the ID target. That is the unique address of another computer in the United States that the hacker has gone into. And then it shows the method of intrusion. Now, on some cases, you're going to see that they use credentials. That means that they have fake credentials because there were administrators that had been placed on the Secretary of State's computers, false administrators. In other cases, it shows that they broke through the firewall. In some cases, they did both. Now, in the next column, it shows whether it was successful. You'll see a Y. That shows that, yes, it was successful. Now, oftentimes, they're not successful, and they have to go back and try for another intrusion, and then it shows whether that's, in fact, successful as well. Then in the final column, what you're seeing are votes changed. Now, in this particular case, when they went into Emmett County, Michigan, the votes that were changed was they stole 3,477 votes from Donald Trump. That's what you're looking at. Now, as you go through this document and you look at all the multiple intrusions into our election, what you'll notice that over 60% of these intrusions come from China.
All right, now we've covered the chain of custody violations in the 2020 election. Let's take a look at federal statute violations. All right, so while it is possible in America to violate chain of custody without violating the law due to variations in state law, federal law under Title 52, Sections 2701 and 2702 help to fill any potential chain of custody gap. Section 2701 requires the preservation of all election records for 22 months, while 2702 prohibits the willful destruction of election records. Now, despite these provisions of federal law, however, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Bensard issued a letter instructing clerks to destroy election records such as electronic poll books. She later proceeded to remove qualified voter file entries in the wake of the 2020 election. Now, these directives amount to multiple counts of election fraud never prosecuted by federal law enforcement officials. So now we're going to go off and look at some state statutes. Now, in Michigan, there is evidence that the following state statutes were violated. MCL 168.735 requires a single poll book. Well, in Detroit, at least 4 separate poll book instances were observed. You also have MCL 168.734, which prohibits election officials from interfering with duties of poll challengers. This law was repeatedly violated in Detroit, and one of the most egregious examples was the refusal to allow poll challengers to enter the TCS centers while military ballots were being duplicated and counted. This infraction is best illustrated by the cardboard on the windows prohibiting oversight even from outside the facility. Unlawful COVID capacity rules were used as a justification for this infraction. And again, another statute that provides poll challengers with the ability to challenge a vote, and once again, this law was repeatedly violated in Detroit. Furthermore, poll workers refused to enter these challenges into the poll book, which impaired the information available later to the Wayne County Board of Canvassers as they deliberated about certifying the election results. The other statute, MTL 168.765, requires one election inspector from each major political party to be present during the execution of absentee ballot processing. This statute was blatantly violated at the Detroit AV County Board. And then we have a statute that requires public notice of the public accuracy test and election processes. This provision of statute was also violated in Detroit. And we also have examples of violation of MCL 168.765A, which defines the requirements for operation of absentee voting counting board, which also prohibits the coaching of voters or partisan displays. These provisions were also repeatedly violated in Detroit with visible attempts to enforce the law by election officials. Next, let's look at some of the violations of our constitutional rights. There are even violations of U.S. Constitution in Michigan state law upon examination. There is also evidence of violations of basic civil rights provisions in our federal and state constitutions, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. All right, so let's turn to an area of election fraud that is seldom addressed in election reform circles, and that's influence operations. The term influence operations is actually rooted in military vernacular. It refers to actions which seek to change or influence public sentiment in such a manner as to favor a particular group or worldview, and typically applies to elections. Perhaps the most egregious examples of influence operations in the 2020 election were on display by big tech companies such as Facebook and Twitter. They even censored the President of the United States. And when the suppressed parties or interested observers claimed that there was a concerted effort to suppress their freedom of speech, they were lampooned and ridiculed as conspiracy theorists. Now, were they indeed conspiracy theorists? Well, according to Molly Ball at Time magazine, not so much. She states that there was indeed a conspiracy to influence the results of the 2020 election in favor of Joe Biden. Matter of fact, the expressed aim of this cabal, if you will, was to control the flow of information. So much for freedom of speech in the 2020 election. Their work actually touched every single aspect of the election, including social media companies before and after the election. All right, that's my cut at summarizing the problems that we have with election integrity in America. Now let's provide some additional information that we'll use later to develop and rate solutions to these problems. Now, before we can effectively analyze solutions, we need to prime the pump with core information on the following topics. What does the U.S. Constitution say about elections? What statutes are in place that actually pertain to elections? And for this purpose, I will focus upon federal, not state election law, as there are significant variations within state law that are beyond the scope of this exercise. We're also going to explore the key roles assumed by people during an election, and then we're going to review the basic election processes, followed by a discussion of the term chain of custody in a little bit more detail than we've talked about before, pertaining specifically to the records produced as a result of these election processes. And last of all, we're going to delve into the topic of influence operations in much more detail. So let's start with our Constitution. The Constitution delegates almost all authority for regulating elections to the state legislatures. In fact, when it comes to the selection of electors for president, the state legislature is granted plenary authority all by itself. Now, plenary authority, the fancy term for complete authority. In other words, according to the U.S. Constitution, the state legislature, not the state executive branch or judicial branch, have the ability to assign electoral college votes for president however they see fit. So if they're observing significant election fraud in their state, the state legislature, without any input from the governor, could legally change the allocation of electoral college votes from the allocations certified by state election officials. Now, beyond these core provisions of the Constitution, three important amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were added to ensure the protection of voting rights for all Americans. Now, in addition to federal provisions in our U.S. Constitution, there are also federal statutes. Now, the key federal statutes pertaining to elections are the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1986 Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, the 1993 Voter Registration Act, and the 2002 Help America Vote Act that occurred in the wake of the dangling Chad scenario in the 2000 election. Okay, now let's review the key roles that are involved in the execution of all of our election processes. This chief state election official, often the Secretary of State, is responsible for the definition and execution of election processes all across the state. The Board of Canvassers are responsible for certification that the election processes were faithfully followed for their pertinent jurisdiction, whether it's state or county or individual municipality. Next, local clerks are the elected officials responsible for the execution of election processes within their jurisdiction, such as a county or a township. The Secretary of State is essentially the clerk of the whole state. Now there's poll workers. Poll workers are paid individuals who assist the clerk in the execution of the election processes. And then there are poll challengers. That's what I served at the Detroit AV County Board. Poll challengers are certified observers authorized to interact with election officials during elections and have their objections recorded in poll books. They've been trained around election law, so they got a little bit more authority than the next group, which is poll watchers. Poll watchers are simply, as the name implies, they're simply election observers that are unable to interact with election officials. Now, in a day and age dominated by mail-in votes, the United States Post Office actually has assumed quite an important role in our election processes, and we need to highlight them as well. Then, of course, voters play a very important role. Then we have candidates and ballot proposal committees that deserve honorable mention, as without them, we'd really pretty much have nothing to vote on. Okay, now well-run elections are much more involved than simply showing up at a poll and checking a box. My cut at breaking down the act of holding an election into manageable bite-sized chunks is as follows. All right, first of all, there's the process of actually registering voters. And you can do that at the time of signing up for your driver's license in a lot of states. You can sign up online. You can sign up over at the Secretary of State's office. Next, there's a significant preparation that goes into holding an election. Ballots need to be printed. Precincts need to be configured. Equipment needs to be purchased and configured. Poll workers need to be hired and trained. Now, the process of voting at the polls versus absentee is significantly different to break it out into two separate processes. So one for poll voting and another one for absentee voting. Once the polls are closed, the process for closing out a precinct and balancing the books is extremely important when it comes to maintaining the chain of custody of election records. And election records are transferred from precincts to the clerk's offices. Election certification is also a unique process that needs to be addressed and occurs at the first and foremost at the precinct level at the time of polls being closed. Now, in the cases where the election results are questioned, the process for recounts is another important process related to elections. The process flows pertinent to each of these process areas are available for download at letsfixstuff.org in the post associated with this podcast. All right, so last but not least, I want to address a very important process that often gets overlooked, and that's the audit process. And I want to highlight that just because there's been an audit of an election does not mean that election fraud would have been discovered. Audits vary significantly in their rigor applied. For example, out of the 15 different categories of election fraud identified by me in the 2020 election in Michigan, 0 of them would have been identified by adherence to Michigan's current statewide audit guidelines. It's important to go beyond calls for an audit and specify the requirements for an audit that have sufficient rigor to identify and to discourage voter fraud. Now let's look and talk about a chain of custody. Now, a good audit is simply a verification that the chain of custody has been maintained. In criminal cases, a judge can throw out a case if the chain of custody regarding evidence has not been maintained. When it comes to elections without any demonstrable chain of custody, the election results should be thrown out as well, or at least not certified. Now, the election records chain of custody can be visualized as a series of links in a chain. Now, each link corresponds to a given election record. We're going to start with the qualified voter file, which links to the poll books, which in turn links to the ballots, which in turn links to vote tallies. So these are just 4 links. You could break it down in much more detail if you wanted to around election records, but this is a little bit more manageable. It's this vote tally link that everybody is anxious to see on election day. And if any link in the chain of custody has been broken, it's important to remind you that all the links downstream of that link that has been broken are effectively broken as well. This is a reason why election recounts do not often ensure the integrity of an election. If the poll books have been fudged to allow ballots by fake or ineligible voters to be counted, a recount of the ballots does not ensure trust in the election results. All right. The first link in the chain of custody is that qualified voter file. Now, in olden days, it was just simply a list of people that were eligible to vote in a given jurisdiction. In modern times, a qualified voter file is an electronic database maintained by the Secretary of State for each state. The records in this database are supposed to be strictly controlled. They are supposed to be updated to reflect new voter registrations, deaths, or changes in residency. Now, most, if not all states, allow voters to be able to look up their voter registration status actually online. Now, the next link in the chain of custody is the poll book, which is essentially just a precinct-specific snapshot of the qualified voter file. Each voting precinct has its own poll book. When you register to vote, you are assigned a voting precinct which corresponds to a specific polling location where you go to vote should you vote in person. A single polling location may feature 1 or more precincts, but each precinct has its own poll book. Poll workers at each precinct use the data in each poll book to verify the identity of each voter and ensure that they are indeed eligible to cast a vote. The poll book can be a paper printout held in a binder or on a computer where it's referred to as an electronic poll book. In addition to verifying eligibility to vote, poll books are also used by poll workers as journals to capture key events related to a given voter or election. For example, when absentee voters are mailed a ballot, the ballot number assigned to that voter is tracked in the poll book so that when the clerk's office receives a ballot in the mail, they're able to help confirm the identity of the voter by matching the ballot number received to the ballot number that was shipped to them as captured in the poll book. The next link in the chain of custody is the ballot itself. Now, modern ballots are often Scantron-based slips of paper compatible with electronic scanning and tabulation equipment. Ballots are actually divided up into 2 sections. One section contains a ballot number, which is often encoded in a barcode as well as a visible number. The other section is a list of ballot questions. Voters are given both parts when they complete their ballot, whether absentee or at the polls. And before a ballot is tabulated, though, the ballot number section is separated from the section with the ballot questions so that no one is able to associate a specific voter with a specific ballot at the time that that vote is being tabulated. Each precinct is responsible for knowing how many ballots have been issued and cast in their precinct. The number of ballots stored after tabulation must equal the number of ballots issued in a poll book for a precinct to be considered balanced, in much the same way as accounting books are balanced. Balanced precincts are especially important when it comes to recounts. Many states, such as Michigan, stipulate that unbalanced precincts are not subject to recount. All right. Counterfeit ballots are often used in ballot stuffing fraud, and these counterfeit ballots can be detected using a variety of techniques as illustrated by subject matter expert Jovan Pulitzer in this following clip.
Well, did you know from a forensic level that you can tell absolutely the difference between paper here in the United States or paper that was made in China? There's different formulations, different inks, even different fibers. And on our systems, we're able to tell every one of these.
He was moved to create technology to check the authenticity of a ballot using a forensic scan. Checking the folds is part of the forensic inspection. Pulitzer explains the technology can also detect the kind of ink used to mark the ballot.
All of these have unique IDs, but the one that was done by a machine, because their printing dynamics are completely different, sticks out like a sore thumb. Here is a faked squiggle by a computer. Even though they could try to come up with fake squiggles by a computer, the one on the right, you still see the artifacts left over by it being a simple printing mechanism. All of these can be easily decoded.
The next and arguably most consequential link in the chain of custody is the vote tally. Precinct-level vote tallies are the basic building blocks for all subsequent vote tallies at the county and municipality and state level. There are also cross-jurisdictional vote tallies for specific races, such as state legislature or Congress. In all cases, if the precinct-level vote tally is captured correctly and reported correctly, it's a pretty straightforward process to verify the accuracy of the downstream tallies. Conversely, if the precinct-level vote tallies are incorrect, everything downstream is incorrect as well. Now, the only federal vote tally is that cast by the Electoral College for President and Vice President of the United States. Now, when using electronic voting systems, it's important to point out that tabulation is a two-step process. First, an image of the ballot is scanned. Second, the scanned image is analyzed by the computer and votes are allocated in accordance with the logic programmed into the computer. This logic should be as simple as stating that a mark on the ballot 1 inch from the top and 2 inches from the left correlates to a vote for candidate A. In some systems, however, such as those produced by Dominion Voting Systems, there is a software module called the Ranked Choice Voting Module, which enables a distribution of the votes between multiple candidates based upon a predetermined percentage. The usage of such modules can be revealed by examination of the raw vote tally streamed from the computer. If fractional votes are evident, votes are being assigned on the basis of a percentage, not the typical whole number allocation of 1 vote per individual.
The strangest anomaly visible in the data is a consistently identical ratio of Biden to Trump votes across time, which is theoretically impossible. Here is Florida. These updates occurred over a week following the election. Notice all the ratios of Biden to Trump votes are 100% identical over several days. This pattern shows up in many states. It appears that a computer algorithm is involved in the process, which is doing something called weighted race distribution, a feature of Diebold voting machines known as early as 2001, which gives values to votes rather than simply counting them. Here in California, we see an update of 1 vote. About 65% of that value is given to Biden and 32% to Trump. How can 1 vote go to more than 1 person?
In order to ensure the accuracy of precinct-level vote tallies, a public accuracy test is supposed to be conducted on tabulation equipment prior to the election. This test involves running a series of sample ballots through the tabulation equipment, which are supposed to reflect all the possible vote permutations during the pending election. Anytime a possible vote permutation is not addressed in the public accuracy test, it leaves an opening for election fraud via machine-based allocation of votes to an option not tested. So, how easy is it to hack a voting machine in order to allocate the votes as you see fit? Well, let's find out by reviewing what happens at what's called the DEF CON conference, which is an annual conference of hackers.
We're loving this one, but most people probably wouldn't.
A room full of hackers, all trying to hack into voting machines.
You can possibly make it accept a fake card or accept any card, so you could add your own votes.
These are supposed to be the latest machines. They're still used in elections, and they're running ancient software. I think that, if somebody wanted to, it would be pretty easy to fake an election.
Less than a couple hours with access, and they're already figuring out ways to break in and play pranks. But it gets more serious.
So you could leave the security key into it and still inject.
I feel like I'm the only one here that hasn't found a vulnerability. It's not what you think. They've all been invited here to demonstrate just how vulnerable the tech we rely on for our elections can be. The experiment is the brainchild of Jake Braun. He's a former security advisor for the Obama administration.
You know, with everything that happened in 16, what we're trying to do is get this industry to mature from a cybersecurity perspective, so you don't have folks saying what they are now, which is things like machines are unhackable or databases are air-gapped and can't be changed.
It's not clear if any actual machines were infiltrated in the 2016 election, and no one has suggested any physical votes were changed. But intelligence officials agreed that Russia was able to meddle with other election-related systems. This inspired Braun and the organizers of this year's DEF CON hacking conference to collect over 30 pieces of voting-related equipment, including voting machines and a mock elections office, and tell a group of hackers to try any means necessary to break into and reverse engineer them. And it didn't take long. Several were compromised within the first hour and a half.
So if you're a voter in America, we're likely hacking a machine that you vote on. There's a few dozen of these machines and also electronic poll books. In some states, people check in on an electronic device as opposed to a paper book.
How you cast your vote varies from district to district. Some places use this machine, some places use that one. Some counties only vote on paper ballots, but almost all of these machines are still in use somewhere in the United States. Some of the hacks might not work if your district has updated the software on the machines, although many don't.
We can go in and hack this lock within 10 seconds. You gain access to the operating system. We could actually remove this and clone this particular USB. We could go back and start looking at and reverse engineering what's on this image and determining the various ways that we can impact this particular operating system.
No one will believe you until...
You guys, no one will believe you?
If they see XP, they're very happy.
Good Lord? Did he just say good Lord? I like that every time it reboots to Windows XP, you hear people groaning behind us. The machines you use to cast your vote aren't the only point of entry for attackers. Other election-related systems, like campaign networks and registration databases, are also at risk.
The vulnerabilities at the voting machine level are very localized, and what we're trying to simulate out here is the entire back-end network.
There's a lot of mischief these guys can do without ever actually having to physically get access to a machine. If they were just to go in and mess up the voter file, you could have millions of people showing up at the wrong precinct or showing up at the right precinct, but the name's wrong in the poll book, and then all of a sudden now they don't know where they need to go.
Intelligence officials have stated that Russia was able to influence the election without the need to penetrate actual voting machines by breaching DNC computers, accessing staffer emails and opposition research. The Department of Homeland Security also found that they targeted election-related systems in as many as 21 states.
If you wanted to go in and specifically manipulate vote counts on every single machine in America, that'd be really hard to do.
Right.
But you don't need to do that to have an impact on the election in 18 either. You only have to flip a couple Senate seats to have an impact on U.S. Congress.
In other words, election fraud doesn't have to be widespread to be significant. Isn't it kind of interesting that some of the same news agencies that were all in on election fraud during the 2016 election all of a sudden say there's no possibility of election fraud in the 2020 election? Ponder that for just a little bit. Okay, well, we're all fixated on laptop screen refreshes on election sites during the election, or watching so-called election results scroll by on your favorite cable news network. Vote tallies actually travel in bits and bytes literally all around the world. This fantastic journey taken by a vote through the modern electronic election system may come as a surprise to many. The way it's supposed to work is that votes are tabulated at the precinct level. Once the precinct has been balanced and signed off by poll workers, the results are sealed, shared downstream to other election organizations such as the municipal clerk, county clerk, or secretary of state. And if the chain of custody is actually maintained, this is a one-way flow of information triggered by the closing of the polls and the subsequent closing of the precinct, which involves securing a final vote tally. So when you see a percent of precincts reporting figure in the media, it's logical to conclude that it corresponds to a percentage of precincts reporting their final vote tally. As it turns out, not so much. You see, unofficial results are shared well before the precinct has been closed. And these unofficial results typically get stuck at 90% or more of the precincts reporting, which are then fed to the media outlets. Little known to voters is the fact that in addition to clerk offices, results are also shared with domestic and overseas data centers that provide this information to the media outlets such as the AP or New York Times. As long as the flow of this information is one way, vote tallies can be relatively secure if they've been secured at the precinct level. Once the door is open for two-way flow of information, or there are opportunities for vote tally data to be intercepted and modified during the transfer from point A to point B, election fraud risk is elevated significantly. Now, there are several ways to vote tally data is transferred from point A to point B. The traditional way is in a sealed packet via ground transportation. This sealed packet may include a flash drive or simply a paper statement of votes that get entered in by a clerk later on. The key term is that they are sealed. More and more election officials, however, are lured by the convenience of a wireless transmission of data. They're told that their cellular data modems are on a VPN network and are air-gapped. Then there are also hardwired Ethernet connections, and IT vendors across the board often advertise that all these systems are actually air-gapped via combinations of firewalls, encryption, and VPN configurations. These sales pitches result in a false sense of security for clerks which may not be tech-savvy enough to understand the fallacy of such statements. You know, affidavits were actually filed in the 2020 election lawsuit by Sidney Powell in Michigan that there is evidence that 13 unencrypted passwords and 75 hash passwords were available on the dark web for Dominion voting systems. These were admin passwords. This information, coupled with voting system file specifications, courtesy of workers at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, practically opened the door for hackers in the 2020 election. The fact of the matter is that internet connectivity makes any network vulnerable to what are called man-in-the-middle attacks. And in such an attack, data transfers from point A to point B are intercepted and modified by somebody at point C before it gets to point B. Once the data has been modified, it continues on its way to point B without folks at point A or point B being all the wiser. The United States intelligence community developed software called the Hammer and Scorecard to execute man-in-the-middle attacks upon foreign nations. Hammer lowered the air-gap shield while Scorecard manipulated the data to achieve the desired result. These tools are still in use today and able to do their dirty work without leaving an electronic footprint. So, now let's go beyond a discussion of election processes to discuss the more nuanced world of influence operations. Now, the purpose of influence operations is simple. Influence voter sentiment in favor or opposition of a given candidate or ballot proposal. Now, how do influence operations shape the opinions of voters about a given candidate or ballot proposal? Well, this is a summary of the primary tools available to influence operators. Funding is first on the list for a reason. It enables all the other tools on this list. It's for this reason that campaign finance information is often seen as a means of improving transparency around influence operations. In any political campaign, the bulk of expenses typically goes towards advertising. TV ads in particular are quite expensive and often most influential. Holding big events can also be quite expensive to stage, but very influential. Everything from venue rental, security services, and keynote speakers do not often come cheap. Sometimes events are staged with minimal expense to generate what is called earned media, which is a fancy term for doing something so outrageous that the media will take notice even if they previously didn't give you the time of day. Another tool is that of censorship. If you can subject the electorate to only one side of the political narrative, you have a much better chance of getting support for your views by the electorate. Which leads to another powerful tool of influence operations, and that's bias. As one who served in elected office for 8 years prior to running for governor, I would often be amazed when I read the newspaper accounts of events that I attended. It often left me wondering if I truly attended the same event that they had attended. I came to the conclusion that most news stories are written well before anybody's even interviewed about that event. The interviews simply fill in the blanks with a few quotes. I refer to this as Mad Lib journalism, harkening back to the word puzzles by the same name that I used to complete for fun as a kid. Bias is an extremely powerful tool used by influence operators to sway opinions. Another way to influence election is by wearing out shoe leather and dialing your fingers off with good old-fashioned direct voter contact. One-on-one conversations or outreach with voters are surefire ways to shape the opinions of voters. Now, all the aforementioned influence tools can be used lawfully, unethically, or unlawfully. Which category a given activity falls into is typically a function of intent and statute. Now first, let's look at some examples of lawful influence operations. Advertising is one example of a lawful influence operation, but it can be expensive. The cost of a 30-second spot during the Super Bowl, for example, can be over $5 million. The goal, of course, is to get consumers to buy the pertinent product. When it comes to elections, the product is a candidate or a ballot proposal. Campaign contributions are another example of lawful influence operations. More often than not, these contributions, especially larger contributions, come with strings attached, which are intended to influence public policy. Speeches or editorials are often intended to influence voters. Policy advocacy organizations, such as political parties, often seek to influence voters regarding specific candidates or broader issues of public policy. Movies, TV shows, and musicians are perhaps today's most significant influencers of culture and voter attitudes. One could make the case that while there are exceptions, these forms of influence operations are all lawful. Then there are activities that may be perfectly legal but fall into this gray area that I'm going to classify as unethical. Organizations and activities which fall under this classification sometimes take advantage of special legal privileges granted to them or loopholes in existing law so as to influence people in unethical ways. The alliance between government and government contractors and government officials, often referred to as the deep state, is one example of a group intent upon influencing others via unethical or non-transparent means. Big tech is much more transparent about their unethical influence operations, but is often unethical in its censorship and so-called fact-checking policies. Media coverage amounts to free advertising for candidates they favor. That's why media bias is such a major concern. Then there's a topic of lawfare, which needs to be explored further. Now we move to unlawful operations, and simply put, unlawful influence operations are those which seek to undermine our system of government and our rule of law. Examples of operators are foreign governments or domestic organizations who advocate for the overthrow of our government. These domestic organizations often do so with the assistance of foreign operators. Now, lawful influence operations don't need much explanation, so let's delve into the topic of unethical operations. You might be surprised to know that our own government and the governments of other countries have actually designed computer systems designed specifically to manipulate voter opinions and election results. Let's see what Patrick Berge has to say on this topic. He's a former government contractor.
My focus was primarily in the development on a couple different contracts for the Department of Defense for the development of the capabilities for interactive internet activities, being something that helps support CNO, which is computer network operations, hacking and different things like that, and information operations, which would be your actual influence operations, right? It's a supporting application that really, it's kind of like a Microsoft project, right? Which allows you to manage large projects, like enterprise level projects, but instead of like managing the building of the construction of a 14-story building, it's managing the most, malevolent operations that you could imagine.
Now, these systems were actually developed by our government ostensibly for national security reasons. Now, what happens when these tools are made available for other purposes?
The NSA data system collects everything through what's called the upstream, where everything is stored for 72 hours, then dumped. However, if one could twin this stream of data, they could privatize it. Imagine what you could do with that.
What would be the impact of upon our election system if these tools were to find their way into the hands of political parties or foreign governments? Okay, let's take a closer look at an industry which has a significant ability to influence voter attitudes. Big tech. Search engines and social media companies which censor or fact-check content shared online have significant power to manipulate what information voters have access to. Now, as a result, Many have called into question the current exemption from civil liability for internet platforms such as Facebook or Twitter. This exemption is cited in Title 47 United States Code under Section 230. You've often heard the term Section 230 protections. The rationale for this exemption is that these computer platforms are merely utilities like water and electricity, so that they should not be held liable for the content shared on their platforms. In recent years, however, the social media industry has gone well beyond being a utility. They've been very aggressive at censoring, shadow banning, demonizing, or deplatforming content with which they disagree. This shift has been accompanied by calls to remove their Section 230 exemption so that they can be subject to civil liability claims, much as traditional media is. Speaking of traditional media outlets, they are very much powerful players in the realm of influence operations. They can shift voter attitudes in a variety of ways, including misrepresenting someone's character. They do not have Section 230 protection and are thus held in check from unethical influence operations by the possibility of defamation lawsuits.
Looks like Covington High School student Nick Sandmann has scored a legal win after being smeared by the media. CNN has settled a $250 million defamation suit Sandmann filed. It's over a confrontation with the Native American man that made the teenager look like the aggressor. Here, a look back at just some of the media coverage.
Some students harassing an older Native American man, a Vietnam vet, in the midst of a special ceremony.
It does look like that young man to me is taunting the Native American Vietnam vet.
This face-to-face confrontation igniting charges of racism.
The kid, Nick Sandmann, he doesn't seem to be afraid, but he did make a choice, and that was to make it into a standoff. That was not a good choice.
Ridiculous, isn't it? You know, but traditional media has other ways of influencing voters beyond outright defamation. When I ran for governor in the state of Michigan, news reports, particularly TV and radio news reports, routinely mentioned two of my competitors while omitting my name altogether. Now, mind you, I was not some fringe candidate. I was a two-term Michigan state senator from the most populous county in the state. I was the first candidate to collect over 15,000 signatures to get on the ballot, and did so via a volunteer army, while other campaigns resorted to paid signature gatherers. I would consistently receive over 75% of the vote at straw polls conducted at events all across the state. And I participated in 13 debates with other candidates, including 3 that were actually televised. Now, despite all of this, only 15% of voters knew who I was on Election Day. Now, despite this disadvantage, I still managed to earn 13% of the vote. But it underscores how the media can influence an election without outright defamation, as was the case with Nick Sandmann. It should be noted that one of the biggest expenses for any campaign is advertising. Now, what happens if the media is overwhelmingly biased in favor of one candidate over the other? They are essentially advertising for their favorite candidate. In donation parlance, this equates to a gift in kind to their favorite candidate. Is this donation tracked? No. But it undoubtedly influences the attitudes of voters. Advocates of limits on campaign finance or on campaign financing or improved donation transparency never seem to address the very real issue of media bias in political campaigns. Even if such advocates were to address the political bias within the media, it would be very difficult to track the financial impact of such in-kind contributions. Another example of unethical influence operations is that of lawfare. Now, rather than promoting the merit of a policy or position or candidate, lawfare typically features a barrage of lawsuits. The lawsuits become the news story, not the policy or the candidate. Even if unsuccessful with the legal action, lawfare is often successful at subduing interest on a topic or candidate by voters. This tactic is often used by those who have weak candidates with significant financial resources against stronger candidates with limited financial resources. Lawfare can be used to suppress information related election malfeasance. Lawsuits can be used to intimidate or threaten people simply seeking to uncover the truth. During active lawsuits, defendants and plaintiffs are often put under gag orders to prevent them from speaking on subject matter pertaining to the case, which effectively buys a plaintiff's time to cover their tracks or delay the release of the truth until it no longer matters. Now we need to venture into the most significant domain of influence operations, and that's unlawful acts. These acts are defined in Title 18 of the United States Code as treason, rebellion or insurrection, seditious conspiracy, and advocating the overthrow of the government. Now, while the media is often kind of dismissive of what they term conspiracy theories, it turns out that there are significant domestic efforts to undermine our system of government, which need to be addressed, not dismissed.
My dream is that we bring these failed and corrupt institutions to their knees and we build something new.
Sounds like she's intent upon undermining our system of government, doesn't it? Now, domestic threats are not the only threats to undermine America. Foreign threats are an ever-present danger. The Department of Homeland Security is one of the many agencies tasked with exposing and countering these threats to our republic. The department breaks down foreign interference into a variety of categories, but for the purpose of our influence operations discussion, I'd like to focus upon information activities. They break down information activities into new media abuse, i.e. big tech, and traditional media abuse, i.e. newspapers and TV and radio. Cyber activities are seen as a mechanism for influencing either of these channels, which is why cyberspace is now classified as a warfare domain by military strategists. All right, that's it for the background material. Now let's define the objectives that we're going to use to evaluate the solutions in this podcast. Okay, now it's important to note that not all objectives have equal importance. That's why I've broken them down into high, medium, and low priority categories. These priorities correspond to weight factors that I apply to any ratings that are used to rank the solutions we're going to discuss in the next section of this podcast. Now, you may have different objectives, which may yield different priorities and different ratings. That's why I provided you with a copy of my analysis spreadsheet for you to evaluate potential solutions according to your priorities and your ratings, if you like. The important thing to note that is, in contrast to many of our elected officials, my objectives and priorities are fully transparent. There's no hidden agenda. Now, here are the objectives that guided my evaluation of potential solutions. First and foremost, as the title of this podcast may suggest, we need to prevent election fraud, and to the degree to which it does that, we're going to give it a rating for all these different solutions. Next, we need to make sure that we enforce our existing laws and maybe make it easier to enforce those existing laws. Next, we need to make sure that we never lose sight of the need to preserve our constitutional rights as we do this. Next, I would submit that we need to demonstrate that we can improve confidence in our election results. Ultimately, we need to believe that the candidate we elected is the one that truly was elected. Another objective should be that we minimize taxpayer expense. No good having a Rube Goldberg, solution if we don't need it. Also, since we're very anxious to see the election results on election night, it would be good to expedite the posting of those results. So we should be measuring how long it takes to get those results with these solutions. And also, I think it's important that we should seek to find ways to mitigate or prevent unlawful influence operations. Okay, we've defined the problem. We've provided some background information that help us to evaluate that problem and potential solutions a little bit better. We've defined our objectives and what we're looking for around these solutions. Now it's kind of the moment you've all been waiting for, right? We're going to start talking about solutions. Okay, for the purpose of our podcast, I've grouped all of our solutions into the following categories. What can everyday citizens do? What can election officials, such as clerks, canvassers, and secretaries of state do? And what can law enforcement do? And what can our judicial officials do? And lastly, what can our legislators do? Let's start by examining what citizens can do. Number one, they need to get out and vote. Now, the 2020 election fraud was difficult to hide because a record number of voters came out to vote. These record numbers broke the algorithms used to shift votes, thereby necessitating additional election subversion tactics that were easier to detect. Next, serve as a poll worker. It's a paid position that requires training and a significant time investment, but if you want to ensure that something is done right, do it yourself. Next, if you're not interested in being a poll worker, the next best thing is volunteer as a poll challenger. It also requires training, but there is no compensation, and you're able to interact with election officials. You could also serve as a poll watcher, which is also a voluntary position, but no training is required. But the downside is that you have no ability to rectify any election malfeasance that you might observe as it is occurring. You can talk about it afterwards so you're blue in the face, but you can't do it in the middle of the election. Another option is to form or join an election integrity organization. Such organizations can be used to share information about elections, train poll challengers, or lobby on behalf of legislation. Also, you can extend your influence in the election process by serving as a precinct delegate. This is a partisan position that yields connections which could be used to extend your influence regarding the preservation of election integrity. Another option is to monitor the news shared by media outlets. Become the fact checker for your personal network of friends and family. How about that for turning things around a little bit? You become the fact checker. People are always looking for somebody that's in the know that can keep them informed, that is somebody that they trust. Be that person. In today's internet era, let's take this to the next level. It's easier than ever to become a citizen journalist yourself and share factual news with the public. That's essentially what I'm doing here at Let's Fix Stuff. You can also volunteer to circulate petitions related to ballot initiatives or distribute informative flyers prepared by election integrity organizations. And one of the most valuable pursuits, I believe, is actually to develop and distribute election official scorecards. Who's doing a good job? Who's not doing a good job? Which communities can you trust the results? Which ones can't you trust the results in? And another option would be to develop and distribute law enforcement scorecards that monitor the performance of prosecutors, sheriffs, and other officers when it comes to enforcing election statutes. Now, here's some examples of election integrity organizations that you can support now or use as a model for starting your own election integrity organization. I personally helped start the Election Integrity Fund here in Michigan. You can go to electionintegrityfund.org to find out more info there. Also, here's some examples of organizations that were formed to monitor the integrity of media organizations. While facts should be objective in theory, however, in practice, a fact checker organization is typically very partisan. There are quite a few of these organizations aligned with the political left, and only one organization of note aligned with the political right. That's Media Research Council. But people are desperate to hear the unvarnished truth from media organizations. Maybe you'll be able to help form one that is truly nonpartisan. Next, scorecards can be a powerful way to preserve election integrity. They promote civic engagement, they promote accountability by our elected officials, and enable the efficient deployment of limited election oversight resources. You can develop your own scorecard for each jurisdiction that covers the topics which matter most to you and your organization. That's it for the citizen to-do list. Now let's look at solutions that can be pursued by our election officials. Election officials, once again, include secretaries of state, clerks, and poll workers. So first, poll worker training, including current election law, is one way to ensure that elections are executed in a fair and lawful manner. Next, election officials need to go beyond training by actually monitoring compliance of their staff and volunteers with the election law. What a concept. I know that didn't happen in Detroit. I can tell you that big time. Another solution is focus on the protection of the ballot link in the chain of custody. And that's to diligently track lot and serial numbers for all your ballots. Any missing ballots should feature an appropriate explanation. Also, the fidelity of the voter registration database should be actively monitored and shared with the public. Each state should have a dashboard that highlights the number of new voters, the number of dead voters removed, the changes of address, etc. All this information will go a long way towards preserving the integrity of the voter registration database link in our chain of custody, and that's that top link. And if that's failed, then everything downstream is called into question. Next, public accuracy test for election equipment is a critical event in preparation for any election. COVID was used as an excuse to limit oversight of this event in the past election. There is no reason, however, why public accuracy tests could not be broadcast online for everybody to view. Now, the same goes for the pre-election walkthrough of election processes. Poll workers, poll challengers, poll watchers, and citizens at large would benefit from a systematic walkthrough of the election processes to be followed on Election Day. The chain of custody for each election record should be clearly demonstrated during that walkthrough, including any network connectivity. Now, in addition to providing an opportunity to cite concerns about the processes before the election, poll challengers can use this information to hold poll workers and election officials accountable for executing these processes on Election Day. The next logical step in the solution list would be to share online a dashboard depicting the status of the election process in each precinct during the election. Concerned citizens could monitor the number of votes cast by precinct as well as the wait time and also the status of election results for individual precincts. Use technology to our advantage for a change. Another solution is for election officials to proactively demonstrate the maintenance of the chain of custody for election records prior to certification, including a log of every modification to every critical election record. Failure to demonstrate preservation of the chain of custody would serve as grounds for prohibiting the certification of a given precinct's votes. And lastly, election officials could open up their election processes to an audit by a third-party organization such as the State Auditor General. Now let's look at solutions that law enforcement officials can implement. All right. First and foremost, they can make sure that they ensure compliance with the election law by all parties equally, without bias. All right. That means they need to have boots on the ground monitoring the conduct of elections throughout all the precincts and across the state. Next, prosecutors and attorneys general need to prosecute violations of the law, once again, without bias. Having laws on the books which are not enforced leads to a general disregard for the rule of law. And you can see this time and time again. If they don't prosecute for election fraud, they just think that they can go off and do it year after year after year. Next, this is something innovative. I think law enforcement can monitor the election chain of custody in cyberspace. I know the 305th Military Intelligence Battalion did that in this last election. They discovered a lot of information you saw in that Absolute Proof video. Lastly, law enforcement officials need to honor their oaths of office and ignore any unlawful directives which may be used to subvert existing statutes designed to preserve the integrity of the election. So we got to be careful on that. Now, a prime example of an unlawful order by election officials was a so-called 6-foot rule dictated by Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and the director of the Michigan Bureau of Elections, Jonathan Brader. A court ordered an injunction upon the 6-foot rule prior to the election, but this didn't prevent some law enforcement officials from enforcing it on election day. Shouldn't be doing that. It has to be in accordance with the law. Now let's look at some solutions that can be pursued by members of the judicial branch. First, due to their time-sensitive nature, I would submit that election fraud cases need to be treated in an expedited manner. In other words, dockets need to be cleared to prioritize election fraud cases. And in general, I saw that happening in the state of Michigan. Next, we need to make sure that the judges are predisposed to issuing temporary restraining orders that prohibit certification of fraudulent election results until forensic audits have been completed. Also, judges need to make sure that they know that they can order recounts in a given election, and if the situation calls for it, they can also ask for a re-vote, which is very important. And last, judges can support law enforcement official requests for subpoenas. Now, the only election information which should not be privy to disclosure under most circumstances are personal voter information, and an individual voter's vote. But too often, particularly in this last election, election data needed for fraud investigation is actually denied from disclosure. Okay, the last category of solutions covers what legislators can do to preserve election integrity. It's a rather long list, so please be patient. There's a lot to cover in this area. First, if your state doesn't already have it codified in law, make sure that demonstration of election record chain of custody is required in statute prior to certifying any election result. Next, require precinct-level results to be presented in a spreadsheet-compatible format supporting data mining at least 72 hours before the certification of any vote in order to allow analyses which could identify potential fraud. Also, it should be mandatory for all poll workers to prominently display their party affiliation while on duty so as to verify compliance with statutes requiring bipartisan observation of certain election processes. Names must be clearly visible so that poll challengers should be able to identify the party affiliation and actually check that affiliation with representatives of the respective political party. Transparency is a continuing theme for good election solutions, and the next solution option would be to require 24/7 web monitoring of election records requiring a chain of custody. In cases where election infractions are identified, the video and audio evidence could be used to assist in prosecutions. Another solution would be to establish election fraud specialty courts. Now, specialty courts have been used with success for veteran-specific issues and drug infractions. Now, many election fraud cases are sufficiently complex to justify specialized courts featuring judges that are subject matter experts on election law and examples of election fraud, so that they're wary of what's really going on out in the world. Next, the benefits of network connectivity for election equipment are far outweighed by the risks associated with election fraud. Prohibit any network connection capability in all election system equipment. That would be a good statute. Another thing that I'd recommend is that it deals with eliminating all electronic voting systems altogether. That's actually what they do in Taiwan, so you can guarantee they're not going to be connected to the internet if there's no electronic equipment to connect to the internet. In order to mitigate the risk of influence operations, I would submit that it's worth considering removal of Section 230 protections for big tech. Also, this seems to be a controversial topic, but it really shouldn't be. Require voter ID to identify, so that you can identify the identity of all voters prior to them being allowed to cast a vote. And next, it's important to note that all audits are not created equal. Audit and canvassing rigors should be codified in law to prevent a rubber stamp audit or certification. Another solution, which does not require any legislation, is simply for the legislators to listen to citizens claiming election malfeasance in publicized committee hearings. They have often subpoena authority that can be leveraged, that can obtain additional information as warranted, but the public soapbox of elected officials can be used to expose election malfeasance if they are willing to do so. Also, it's important to understand that early voting is used by election fraud enthusiasts to smooth out the curve of vote injections needed to ensure victory for their candidates. Early voting should be prohibited by law. Same-day voter registration compromises the integrity of poll books and creates chaos during the elections. Same-day voter registration should be prohibited by law. Another possible statute would be to prohibit the posting of election results until the precinct level election results have been signed off by election officials. In other words, no more unofficial election results. Unofficial election results, much like early voting, can be used by nefarious actors to project vote injections required before official election results are actually publicized. Another bill option would be to prohibit the counting of any precinct which failed to balance their books and demonstrate chain of custody maintenance. In Detroit, there are 71% of the precincts that failed to balance their books. That behavior needs to be stopped, and this is one way to go off and encourage good behavior in that regard. Now, while poll challengers are able to view voter identification at the polls, they're often prohibited from viewing the verification of absentee voter identity that occurs at the clerk offices. Legislators can pass legislation which requires clerks to provide access to poll challengers at the clerk's office when they're verifying the identity of absentee voters. Legislation requiring election integrity scorecards could be developed and posted for all jurisdictions. This transparency would provide a mechanism for increased oversight in jurisdictions with persistent deficiencies. Also, existing statutes requiring bipartisan oversight of election processes are very difficult to enforce. Lawmakers can pass legislation requiring each jurisdiction to receive party approval of their lists of poll workers and their assignments prior to Election Day. Also, mail-in voting based upon voter registration databases with an average of 20% invalid registrants is a recipe for election fraud. Legislation can be introduced to prohibit mailing of absentee ballot applications and ballots unless specifically requested by a voter. Also, legislators always have the option to decertify fraudulent elections, particularly federal elections, due to the plenary authority granted to them under Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. So in addition to that plenary authority under the U.S. Constitution, another option for state or local officials to invoke in cases of rampant or specific cases of election fraud is to invoke quo warranto provisions in statute that require a candidate to demonstrate proof of their election victory before they assume office. Such a demonstration would require this proof of the chain of custody regarding election records. So that's another way of going off and approaching this. All right, that's my latest cut at solutions to preserve election integrity. You may have additional suggestions. If so, please share them with me at our Let's Fix Stuff emergency broadcast forum. Now, what I'd like to do is actually see how these solutions stack up against one another, so we can kind of identify what solutions we should prioritize. If we try to do all of them all at once, we're not going to get any of them done. So let's try to prioritize these and identify the top 3 solutions in each one of these solution categories. All right, let's see how these solutions stack up against one another. And here's a plot of all the scores for each of our solutions as captured in our solution analysis spreadsheet. Remember, this solution spreadsheet is available for download by Right Stuff Club members in this post for this podcast at letsfixstuff.org. Now, the top solution should come as no surprise to anybody familiar with the 2020 election. It turns out we already have quite a few statutes on the books already to prevent election fraud. What we appear to be lacking, particularly in this last election cycle, is the willingness to actually enforce these statutes. When it comes to the bottom solution in the ranking, it's that of becoming a precinct delegate. Now, just because it's ranked last does not mean that it's not important and doesn't have any value. It simply means that the other solutions that have been proposed satisfy our objectives better. So, now it's time to reveal the top 3 solutions for each category, followed by the overall top 3. So, we're going to start off with delving into what are the top 3 solutions that citizens can engage in and do. Number 1, serve as a poll worker. In other words, if you want to make sure something's done right, do it yourself. So serve as a poll worker. Then you can go off and become an activist in your community by developing elected official scorecards. So judge each election jurisdiction by how well they protect election integrity. And by the way, you can do the same thing with law enforcement. Put scorecards together on law enforcement and their willingness to enforce the law. When it comes to election officials, well, train poll workers on the election law. Then monitor their compliance with the law that you've instructed them on. And then look for outside counsel. Solicit the Auditor General to do an analysis of your particular jurisdiction to make sure that you are protecting the integrity of the election. When it comes to law enforcement, make sure that you prosecute violations of the law without bias. Also, ignore unlawful directives that undermine election integrity, and then monitor the chain of custody in cyberspace. This is something innovative, but that's what the 305th Military Intelligence Battalion was tasked to do for across the country. When it comes to your judicial branch, support law enforcement investigations with subpoenas. Expedite the consideration of election fraud cases because of the timelines. Issue temporary restraining orders that prohibit certification of fraudulent elections until we can have a forensic audit completed. When it comes to the legislative branch, well, let's look into putting legislation forward that requires 24/7 public web-based video monitoring of key records in the chain of custody. And then establish election fraud specialty courts and override any results that have been certified by election officials if the election fraud has been found to be evident. Now, the top 3 solutions overall are, number 1, prosecute violations of the law without bias. Number 2, ignore unlawful directives that undermine election integrity. And number 3, train poll workers on election law. All right, everybody, that's a wrap on Build 2.0 of our Election Integrity Solution Podcast. Now you're equipped to discuss the problems that we have with our election integrity. You can share a lot of background information on how elections are run. You can clearly define some objectives that we need to go off and pursue, and you can provide a list of solutions for which we can advocate. And you can also highlight which are the top solutions that we should be pursuing. All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this podcast. The bottom line is that we need to do more than pass new laws to protect the integrity of our elections. We need to engage more than our legislators. It will take a team effort from everyday citizens like you. Now, if you'd like the information that we shared today, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Remember, you can review the citations and analysis spreadsheet supporting this podcast at letsfixstuff.org. If you have any ideas on how to improve this analysis, please share them on our emergency broadcast forum at letsfixstuff.org. If you have friends and family members which like to fix stuff, please send them our way. Our nation is in desperate need of folks interested in rational, data-driven solutions to the problems that we face. Help us build a community of problem solvers, not pundits, by joining the Right Stuff Club at letsfixstuff.org. Thank you all for your support. Over and out.